the pearl.
Martial law in Beijing may end within 2 days. Noriega points an accusing finger at the United States. The CMB wants higher bus fares. New protests break out in Eastern Europe. And a British film legend is dead at the age of 78. Good evening. Martial law in Beijing may be over within the next 2 days. Chinese Premier Li Peng is expected to announce the decision tomorrow. Sources in Beijing say the authorities have decided to lift martial law because the capital has gradually returned to normal. They say positions that are now under military control will be turned over to the police, but the army will not be completely removed from the capital. Soldiers are expected to be moved to less conspicuous positions. Analysts say the move is meant to appease foreign governments. Japanese banks, meanwhile, have decided to send a mission to China in March, but the government remains cautious about lifting sanctions against Beijing. Government advisors in Hong Kong have rejected a draft of a Bill of Rights for the territory. They say the draft is meaningless because it does not contain any provisions to stop the Beijing government from overriding it after China assumes control of the territory in 1997. Philippine President Corazon Aquino says new uses should be found for American bases in the Philippines. She says changes in Eastern Europe show a move towards détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. The demonstrators that toppled East Germany's hardline communist government have taken to the streets again. They're unhappy with the pace of reform. The protesters say the Communist Party still has too much power. More than 100,000 people filled the streets of Leipzig shouting "Down with communism" and calling for German reunification. Earlier, opposition parties came close to boycotting important meetings with the government. They accused the communists of trying to mislead the public over the disbanding of the dreaded secret police. The opposition is afraid that the force known as Stasi is still very active. Opposition leaders say they'll give the government 1 more week to come up with a solution to the problem before calling their members out on the streets for more demonstrations. In Romania, the first member of Nicolae Ceausescu's security forces has been sentenced. A military tribunal in the provincial city of Sibiu has begun a series of trials of Securitate members. Among those who've yet to be tried is Ceausescu's son, Nicu. Andrew Brown reports.
Ion Bundiau is accused of trying to kill an army officer. He's watched and questioned by a military tribunal. He has no right of appeal, but the government has abolished the death sentence, making jail sentences for Securitate members the most likely punishment they will face. At one point, Bundiau is nearly in tears, pleading his innocence. When he finishes, the tribunal sits in absolute silence, considering his case. The secret police member spent a whole career stocking up files on fellow Romanians for one government. It takes another government just a few seconds to type up his name in their black book. The tribunal's clerk records that this Ceausescu loyalist will go to prison for 9 years. Andrew Brown, TVB News.
Hungarians are now paying the price for a free market. The reform-minded government has ended price controls, and the cost of consumer goods has risen by at least 25%. We get more from WTN.
Hungarians were shocked and angered by the price rises, despite a government campaign to prepare them for the belt-tightening measures. The cost of the most basic consumer items has risen by more than 25%, leaving Hungarians facing not only food shortages, but prices they can ill afford. Meat is up by 32%, while milk and dairy products have almost doubled in price. But the drastic rises haven't just affected food prices. The cost of imported cars shot up by 25%, as did petrol. The government justified the price hikes, saying they were the result of an austerity budget adopted last month. It also said it would offset the increases by raising state pensions and family allowances. But from the 1st of February, Hungarians will also have to pay double for public transport, 35% more for house rental, and face a 300% rise in rates. Trade unions say the increases will push as many as 3 million Hungarians below the poverty line.
Deposed Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega claims that the U.S. once asked him for permission to use Panama as a base for an invasion of Nicaragua. Noriega made those charges during an interview with the Soviet press several months back. But his words could come back to haunt the Bush administration. Details from WTN.
The interview was recorded 3 weeks before American troops stormed into Panama and drove Noriega from power. Now the dictator is languishing in a Miami jail, while Panama is being run by the US-backed government of Guillermo Endara. Before the invasion, the US had placed an economic embargo on Panama to force the military leader to capitulate. Noriega told Soviet viewers that the United States wanted to remove him because he refused to allow Panama to be used as a bridgehead for a full-scale attack on the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. However, a different version of the story has emerged from the United States, where it's reported that when approached for help in the fight against the Nicaraguan government, Noriega offered to assassinate every leader of the Sandinistas. The then White House aide, Oliver North, relayed Noriega's proposal to Admiral Poindexter, who turned it down. However, he did accept the general's second proposal to carry out covert bombing operations in Nicaragua. At his trial, Noriega's defense is likely to revive more stories of links with the US. If the general can prove in court that his drugs activities were known to Washington, then the trial could be more damaging to President Bush than he's so far admitted.
Jailed black South African nationalist leader Nelson Mandela is expected to be freed within weeks. During a prison meeting, Mandela asked his wife Winnie to begin making arrangements for his release. James Robbins has more details.
After 27 years visiting Nelson Mandela in prison, today, unusually, his wife Winnie looked happy as she came out, herself convinced the ANC leader will finally be freed, and soon. During 3 hours together for the first time, Nelson Mandela and his wife discussed arrangements for his release. With her lawyer beside her, Mrs. Mandela said she now believes freedom could come in weeks rather than months.
There's really not much I can discuss. Suffice to say, it is the first time that he has called us to discuss preliminary arrangements to discuss preparations for his release.
Mrs. Mandela didn't want to speculate exactly when her 71-year-old husband might be free. They've been kept apart for all but 4 years, since they were married in 1958. Winnie Mandela was in court in Pretoria when her husband and other ANC leaders were sentenced to life imprisonment, convicted of trying to overthrow white minority rule. But more than a quarter of a century later, now that President de Klerk is himself publicly committed to ending white minority rule, he has no choice but to free Nelson Mandela. Mr. de Klerk and his ministers are facing the fact no other credible black leader will even consider coming to the negotiating table as long as Mr. Mandela remains a prisoner, the single most important figure in black politics.
2 British politicians in Vietnam say there is no sign that a group of boat people forcibly repatriated from Hong Kong have been punished for trying to flee.
The 2 parliamentarians on the first day of their investigative tour travelled to Hai Phong, Vietnam's major northern seaport where so many of the boat people leave from. Both men have said that their brief is not to decide whether people should be returned, but what risk there is when they are. They're meeting most of the 51 who were forcibly repatriated from Hong Kong last December, mostly women and children. This is how they looked then, hustled out of their Hong Kong camp and flown to Hanoi to an uncertain welcome. They have been divided into 4 units, living with relatives or friends because they sold their homes to pay for the boat trip. They suffer the usual hardships. Vietnam is a country of poor people sharing poverty. The poverty so many risk so much to leave. But they're better off than a lot, with a £15 a month United Nations grant and a £330 resettlement grant from the British government. This is 10-year-old Le Van Tan, the bewildered little boy in the photograph on the night of the Hong Kong evacuation. He has squares of plaster on his temples, traditional medicine for a headache that won't go away. Just across the way from him are the boats on the river to the sea, for those people who still believe that it's an easy way out and still need convincing that there's a certain hard way back again.
There will be a top-level reshuffle on the Chinese side of the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group. Ambassador Ke Zai-shuo, the team's leader, will retire. He'll be replaced by the man who's in charge of Hong Kong affairs in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Betty Liu reports.
65-year-old Ambassador Ke Zai-shuo arrived in Hong Kong in 1988 to set up a permanent office for the JLG Group. He's responsible for negotiating with the British on matters relating to Hong Kong in the run-up to 1997. Ke is regarded as a liberal, and he will be living in Beijing upon retirement. His successor, 59-year-old Kuo Fengmin, is the director of the Foreign Ministry's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office. An experienced diplomat, Kuo was the Chinese ambassador to Bonn prior to his involvement in Hong Kong affairs. Betty Liu, TVB News.
The China Motor Bus Company is asking for a fare increase averaging 10%. The company wants to pass along the cost of a multi-million-dollar retirement scheme it agreed to last month. Peter May's reports.
CMB passengers may soon be paying more when they hop on the bus in Hong Kong. The 10% fare hike request was submitted to the government not long ago. Altogether, it works out to a 10% increase, although fares will be boosted by a larger chunk than that on the urban north side of the island, less on the south side. CMB officials say it simply reflects the higher cost of doing business. Since they have to pay more for their workers' pensions, bus riders will have to pay more too. The company also cites inflation as a factor in the request. Now it's up to a series of government boards, agencies, and councils to review the fare proposal. The Transport Department gets the first shot. Officials there are already poring over the plan. They'll pass it along to the Transport Branch, on to the Transport Advisory Committee, and ultimately the Executive Council will have the final decision. All that could take several months. CMB has already been criticized for trying to pass along the cost of a $60 million retirement scheme to its customers. That debate will continue to surface as the various government bodies tackle the company's request.
The infamous Kowloon Walled City is scheduled to be demolished in mid-1992. But so far, the government has not yet decided on how best to do it. As Mimi Young reports, a mixture of demolition methods may be used.
The mammoth demolition project of Hong Kong's most notorious slum was announced by the government 3 years ago. By now, half of its population has been resettled elsewhere. When all its 50,000 people are gone by mid-1992, the whole walled city will be razed to make room for a park. The original idea is to use explosives for the demolition job. But a government feasibility study has pointed out that the method cannot be extensively used, especially in those areas adjacent to nearby buildings. The other problem is the absence of formal blueprints for the structures to be torn down.
None of the building was built by an sort of approved architect, and plans are not available. So we have to work out a formula using the strengths of all the three devices, namely the explosive way, the mechanical way, and also the sort of by manual demolition.
Lui added that a dozen consortiums have expressed interest in tearing down the walled city, but the government will advertise it internationally before deciding on who should have the right to remove the territory's biggest eyesore. Mimi Young, TVB News.
British comedy actor Terry Thomas has died at the age of 78. He established his reputation on the big screen as a sneering English cad. Thomas had been suffering from Parkinson's disease for 15 years.
The onset of Parkinson's disease in the mid-70s ended Terry Thomas's career. Apart from a few commercials to help with medical bills, he was never to act again. As he became progressively worse, he was forced to sell all his properties to pay for treatment. It was a deterioration he'd seen coming.
If you got a wonky hand and you're depressed, you've got a wonky hand and you're depressed, and that's the end of it. If somebody tells you that you've got Parkinson's disease, it starts a new thing altogether.
Typecast as the aristocratic rogue